ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that the atmosphere surrounding General Hospital has begun to shift in a way that feels heavier than a simple casting change, as if something essential has quietly slipped out of place and left behind a silence no one quite knows how to fill. At the center of that silence is the sudden absence of Jason Morgan, a presence that has long anchored not just storylines but the emotional rhythm of Port Charles itself. His disappearance does not register as a pause. It lands like a rupture, one that exposes how fragile the balance of power and loyalty truly is when a figure like Jason is removed without warning. Outside the boundaries of the fictional world, that rupture takes on another layer of tension, one that feels far more personal and far less controllable. Michelle Lundstrom has found herself at the center of an increasingly intense wave of criticism following Steve Burton's decision to step away from the show. What might have remained a private matter has instead become a public storm, fueled by speculation, frustration, and the deeply emotional investment that audiences carry into a series that has shaped their daily routines for years. The line between character and actor blurs quickly in a world like this, and for many viewers, Jason's absence does not feel like a storyline shift. It feels like a loss they were never prepared to process. The criticism directed at Michelle is not simply about a decision, it is about what that decision represents. For a portion of the audience, her presence in Steve's life has become entangled with the fear that his departure might not be temporary. That fear grows in the absence of clear answers, feeding into a narrative that positions Michelle not as a partner supporting her family, but as a force influencing a direction fans cannot accept. It is an unfair simplification, yet one that gains traction because it speaks directly to the anxiety at the heart of the situation, the possibility that Jason Morgan may not return. That possibility lingers like a shadow over everything. The longer the absence stretches, the more it reshapes perception. What was initially framed as a temporary step back begins to feel uncertain, then unstable, and finally, for some, almost irreversible. In a show built on continuity and long-term emotional investment, uncertainty is not neutral, it is destabilizing. Every episode that unfolds without Jason reinforces the idea that something fundamental has changed, and with that realization comes a growing sense of unease that extends beyond the screen. Michelle's response, however, does not align with the narrative being projected onto her. From her perspective, this moment is not about control or influence, it is about protection. Protecting her marriage, her family, and the private space that exists beyond the reach of public expectation. Yet that intention becomes difficult to communicate in an environment where every action is interpreted through the lens of speculation. The more she chooses to stand her ground, the more that stance is reframed as something else, something calculated, something strategic, something that feeds into the very fears she is trying to distance herself from. This disconnect creates a tension that mirrors the conflicts within Port Charles itself. Just as characters in General Hospital often act out of necessity only to be misunderstood by those around them, Michelle's position becomes one where intention and perception move in opposite directions. She is attempting to hold on to something real in a situation that is rapidly becoming abstract, shaped by voices that do not see the full picture but feel entitled to define it anyway. For the audience, the emotional response is equally complex. Their frustration is not purely about Michelle, nor is it solely about Steve's absence. It is rooted in the disruption of a connection that has been built over time, one that feels deeply personal even though it exists within a fictional framework. Jason Morgan represents more than a character. He embodies consistency, resilience, and a kind of moral clarity that persists even in the most chaotic circumstances. Removing him from that world creates a vacuum, and that vacuum demands to be filled with explanation, with reassurance, with anything that can restore a sense of stability. When that reassurance does not come, speculation takes its place, and speculation, once it gains momentum, rarely remains grounded. It stretches, distorts, and eventually settles into narratives that feel convincing not because they are accurate, but because they offer a way to make sense of uncertainty. In this case, that narrative has begun to revolve around Michelle, positioning her as a central figure in a decision that is far more layered than it appears on the surface. What makes the situation particularly volatile is the sense that this is not just a temporary disruption, but a potential turning point. The idea that Steve Burton might not return to General Hospital carries implications that extend far beyond a single character arc. It suggests a shift in direction, a redefinition of relationships, and a restructuring of the narrative foundation that has supported the show for decades. For longtime viewers, this is not just change, it is the possibility of losing something that has defined their engagement with the series. And yet, within that tension lies a quieter, more grounded truth. Michelle's actions, however they are perceived, are rooted in a reality that exists outside the demands of storytelling. She is navigating a life that does not pause for audience expectations, making decisions that prioritize stability over continuity, intimacy over spectacle. The challenge is that these priorities do not translate easily into a space where every development is expected to serve the narrative, to enhance the drama, to satisfy the audience's need for resolution. As the situation continues to unfold, the emotional landscape remains unsettled. Viewers are left balancing their attachment to a character with their understanding of the real-world dynamics that influence the show's direction. Michelle stands at the intersection of those two forces, absorbing the weight of reactions that are as intense as they are divided. Some see her as a source of disruption, others as a woman defending what matters most. Neither perspective fully captures the complexity of what is happening, yet both contribute to the atmosphere of tension that now surrounds this chapter of General Hospital. In the end, what lingers is not just the question of whether Jason Morgan will return, but what his absence reveals about the fragile relationship between fiction and reality. The storylines on screen may be written, controlled, and carefully structured, but the forces shaping them are far less predictable. And in that unpredictability, every decision carries a ripple effect that extends far beyond its origin. For now, the uncertainty remains, stretching across both the narrative of Port Charles and the lives connected to it. Michelle continues to hold her position, steady despite the noise, while the audience waits, watches, and wonders whether this moment will pass or become something permanent. Because in a world built on dramatic turns and unexpected returns, the most unsettling possibility is not change itself, but the idea that this time the change might last. A quiet but persistent unease begins to spread through the world of General Hospital, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping realization that something once thought unshakable may no longer be guaranteed. The possibility that Jason Morgan might never return does not arrive as a clear statement, but as a lingering doubt that grows heavier with each passing day. It is this uncertainty that becomes the true source of obsession, not just for the audience, but for those whose lives both on and off the screen have become entangled in his absence. What makes this fear so powerful is not simply the loss of a character, but the collapse of a sense of permanence. Jason has always represented something stable within the chaos of Port Charles, a figure whose presence could anchor even the most volatile storylines. Without him, the narrative begins to drift, and that drift creates a vacuum that cannot easily be filled. The longer the silence lasts, the more that vacuum transforms into something darker and anxiety that what once felt temporary may now be irreversible. Within that growing tension, Michelle Lundstrom becomes an increasingly complicated figure. The pressure surrounding her is no longer just about public criticism, it begins to take on a more emotional, almost volatile dimension. For some, she becomes the focal point of frustration, a symbol of a change they cannot control. And as that frustration intensifies, it feeds into a narrative that frames her not just as a participant in Steve's life decisions, but as a force behind a transformation that threatens to reshape the future of the show itself. That perception, whether fair or not, creates a new kind of hostility, one that is not always loud but deeply persistent. It builds in the spaces where answers are missing, where speculation fills the gaps left by silence. And in that environment, every action Michelle takes is magnified, interpreted, and often misunderstood. What might simply be an effort to protect her family begins to look through the lens of fan anxiety, like control. What might be resilience begins to resemble defiance. The emotional distance between intention and perception widens, and within that distance, resentment quietly takes root. At the same time, the future of General Hospital itself begins to feel uncertain in a way that goes beyond any single storyline. Jason's absence is no longer just a narrative gap, it becomes a question mark hanging over the structure of the show. If he does not return, then the dynamics that have defined relationships, conflicts, and alliances for years must inevitably shift. And if the show attempts to fill that absence through recasting, the consequences could be just as destabilizing. The idea of another actor stepping into Jason's role introduces a different kind of tension, one that strikes at the heart of identity. Jason Morgan is not just a character, he is a presence shaped over time, built through a specific performance that audiences have come to associate with authenticity. Recasting him would not simply continue the story, it would challenge the very perception of who Jason is. And for a character so deeply tied to consistency and loyalty, that kind of shift risks creating a fracture that cannot easily be repaired. For Jason, as a narrative figure, such a change would represent more than an adjustment, it would be a disruption of identity. The character would be forced into a new interpretation, one that might struggle to align with the emotional history that viewers have invested in for years. Every interaction, every decision, every moment of recognition would carry the weight of comparison, of expectation, of doubt. Instead of restoring stability, recasting could amplify the sense that something essential has been lost. This is where the true dilemma emerges. If Jason does not return, the show must redefine itself in his absence. If he is recast, the show risks alienating the very audience it seeks to reassure. Either path carries consequences that extend far beyond a single storyline, reaching into the core of what makes General Hospital feel familiar, reliable, and emotionally grounded. Amid all of this, Michelle remains at the center of a storm that continues to evolve. The emotions directed toward her frustration, suspicion, even hostility are not static. They shift, intensify, and sometimes contradict each other, reflecting the deeper uncertainty that fuels them. She becomes in many ways a mirror for the audience's own fears, a figure onto whom they project the anxiety of losing something they are not ready to let go of. And yet, beneath that projection lies a more complex reality. Michelle is not shaping the future of General Hospital in isolation. The forces at play are larger, involving creative decisions, contractual realities, and personal priorities that extend beyond any single influence. But complexity rarely survives in moments of emotional upheaval. Simpler narratives take hold, and those narratives often require a focal point, someone to embody the change that feels so difficult to accept. As the situation continues to unfold, the sense of obsession does not fade, it deepens. It lingers in every unanswered question, every ambiguous update, every moment where the possibility of Jason's return remains just out of reach. The future of General Hospital hangs in that uncertainty, balanced between what it has been and what it might become. And in that fragile space, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Whether Jason returns as he was, is reimagined through another face, or remains absent altogether, the impact of this moment will not simply pass. It will reshape the emotional landscape of the show, redefining how characters connect, how stories unfold, and how audiences engage with a world they have long considered constant. Because sometimes, the most powerful change is not the one that happens suddenly, but the one that lingers quiet, unresolved, and impossible to fully understand until it has already altered everything.